Spiritual spaces are harming neurodivergent people. In this video, I'm going to explain why. And if you are neurodivergent, I'd really like for you to zone in on what I'm saying because I'm going to provide you some information that can help you remain safe. My name is Dr. Felucia. I'm a licensed psychologist and owner of Skill Set Counseling, where I focus on the recovery from spiritual abuse. So, spiritual spaces harming neurodivergent people. I wish that it was a topic that was discussed more. It's not. And I'm going to talk specifically about some of the characteristics of neurodivergence that make this harm more likely to happen. So I'm sure you're wondering, what is neurodivergence? It's a term that I'm sure a lot of people have heard, especially more recently. Um, Neurodivergence simply means that the brain of the neurodivergent person is a variation of how most brains perform. It's different, but it's not worse. And that is a very important shift in thinking about these kinds of disorders. So, not a long time ago, but in the past, a lot of these neurodivergent conditions were looked at as very bad things to have and things that you have to get rid of. But now the focus is changing. And basically, it is showing that neurodivergent people, their brains just work in ways that are not really suited for current society's rules and norms. Okay, so I'm going to describe or tell you about some conditions that fall under the neurodivergent umbrella. Things like ADHD, autism, OCD, there's Tourette's, and then anything with sensory processing. So whether it's sensory processing sensitivity, also known as being an HSP, highly sensitive person, or just other things related to how the neurodivergent individual input processes sensory information. So I've described some neurodivergent conditions, and I want you to also remember that it's not worse, it's just different. Um, and also, there is a spectrum of neurodivergence. And so some people could be on I would say maybe the milder end. And all the milder end means is that it's just closer to society's norms. Remember, how we're defining typical and divergent is based on what we see in terms of frequencies. Most people's brains work this way, so that's considered typical. And then people whose brains don't work that way, that's considered neurodivergent. And also the compatibility between the person's brain functioning and societal norms. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about how spiritual spaces can harm neurodivergent people. The first thing is that when neurodivergent individuals sometimes have a difficult time assimilating into groups. It's not true all the time, but it can be true for a lot of them, even within their own families. And so if you're a neurodivergent person, I want you to think about how your socialization has been. Do you find that you get along with others? Do you find that you find groups challenging? My point in saying all of this is that some neurodivergent people may not have a close friend group or even communications with their family, right? They may be experiencing more loneliness and just a strong desire, like all of us, to belong somewhere. And spiritual spaces can exploit that, especially those who are spiritually abusive, right? So, in spiritually abusive spaces, they feel entitled to two things: your time and your resources, right? And so a neurodivergent individual may come to a situation not having a lot of social support. And so they will be more willing to give up their time and their resources just to belong. I want you to think about this. The human desire to belong to a group is very strong and very powerful. It might vary from individual to individual, but there is something very powerful about being a part of a group and having a shared identity. And for, many neurodivergent folks, it's either harder for them or they just don't have that. And so when they see the church as their new family, they may be more eager to jump in. And I'm not just talking about church, it could be any spiritual space, right? And so that's important because a spiritually abusive environment, and even one that's not, can take advantage of that, right? And we've talked about a lot of these things before, but I want you to remember the entitlement, time and resources. Neurodivergent person may be more likely to give those things up. Another thing that can be really difficult for neurodivergent people in spiritual spaces is their difficulty with setting boundaries, right? And so some neurodivergent people struggle with this, some don't. But what I'm talking about links to the prior point I brought up. If you are in a situation where you've really kind of been punished socially, you're having a lot of punishing interactive experiences with people, you feel isolated and left out a lot, you are going to want to be a part of a group pretty badly. And so for some individuals, they may not hold fast to their boundaries simply so that they can belong, right? And so maybe, I'll give you an example. Maybe for you, you do not like to spend time with people who drink alcohol because you are recovering from alcoholism. So that's a strict boundary that you have. And then you meet somebody, you don't have any friends and they seem like they're kind of the only option, but they drink a lot. And every time they're hanging out, they want you to drink. Well, if you are a person who has strong social support, you can, reject that and not hang out with the person. But imagine not having anybody, you may be more likely to weaken those boundaries a bit. I'm not saying that person's going to go into full-blown alcoholism again, but they might say, well, okay, I'll come with you this time or whatever. So my point is, the boundaries are difficult to establish when you're neurodivergent. Another thing is that spiritually abusive people are extremely manipulative, right? They know what to say, they know how to say it, they know how to, turn the screws on you, so to speak. And I've, seen this many times, and even how people will ask for requests, right? So think about a situation where maybe the leader of the spiritual environment called you out in front of everyone and say, oh, we're having a family travel in from this place and we really need to host family. And I'm sure you guys would be, you guys would be fine with hosting them, right? We really need your support and, thank you in advance for doing that. So they're asking you in front of a group of people. And so it's going to be harder to say no. So imagine if you are a neurodivergent individual, you may not even really pick up on what is happening. You might feel more pressure to say yes. Now, again, I talk about these things on my channel, and you must think in nuanced terms. I can't explain every single exception to the rule. I'm talking about generalities. And so for some people who are neurodivergent, it might be hard for them to set those boundaries, right? Um, People who are not neurodivergent have moved through life hearing a lot of messages about themselves, how they don't communicate this way, you don't communicate properly, you're not doing this the right way, you're not doing that the right way. And so they can take on this identity of I'm flawed and I need to do whatever I can to fit in. So that's really important that you realize that. And even places that are not spiritually abusive can engage in these types of behaviors. Um, People who are neurodivergent also can have difficulty reading social cues and interpreting social cues. And so when something nefarious, like, some kind of manipulation to try and get you to do something, if that's present, someone who's neurodivergent may have a more difficult time with that and in reading through those cues and being able to interpret what's going on. There's some more ways too that spiritual spaces can harm neurodivergent individuals. One has to do with sensory processing, right? And so even if you don't have like a sensory processing sensitivity or sensory processing disorder, being in those types of environments can be very overwhelming for anybody who's neurodivergent. And the types of environments I'm talking about are the ones that are very noisy, right? So maybe their worship service, they have like flashing lights everywhere. It's at top volume. Guitar sounds are blaring in your ear. People are jumping up and down and dancing. And for somebody who is neurodivergent, that can be extremely overwhelming and sometimes even intolerable. So, imagine yourself being in that situation, right? Your nervous system is completely flooded with all these senses and you're trying your best to just do what you need to do. And I have witnessed this, that in these types of environments, many of them tend to be charismatic, not all, but many. They will shame people for their reaction to this rock concert type worship. So they may say things like, well, you need to get excited. If you get excited at football games, you can get excited for the Lord. And so they'll say things like that, right? Really manipulative things. Or, yeah, they'll point out people who are, dancing and going all out. You'll say going crazy for the Lord and say, hey, that person, oh, they're a worshiper. They really love God. And so if you're just sitting there with your hands in your pockets, then, you need to confess your sins and all this other stuff. And they're not realizing that that is, number one, a very dangerous and harming message, because you can't assess somebody's spiritual condition from how they behave outwardly. That's why, if the people who are saying this, if they read the Bible, they would see oftentimes that external appearances can be very deceiving, and people deceive people all the time. So imagine you're a neurodivergent person and you're hearing this, and you don't love God, or you don't love other people, or whatever. You're being judged for that. That's very difficult. And, I've talked with people both personally and professionally about their experiences, and they felt harmed, but not only harmed, they were basically being told that the way they are is worse than everybody else. You're defective. Society already sends that message a lot of times to neurodivergent people. Now, they're not going to say it out loud, but there are very few accommodations for neurodivergence in typical society. And so I think about it like somebody being left-handed, right? Our society is a right-handed society. There's nothing wrong with being left-handed. It's not worse than being right-handed. It's just different. And so think about neurodivergence that way. And people who are very sensitive to sounds and smells and lights and everything can just feel like they're going to shut down in that kind of environment. You may see things like they don't attend anymore. They may sit in the back and head out and then come back later when all the noise has died down. And so it's important to think about that. And I really would like people to stop saying you're this type of Christian or this type of spiritual person, whatever the religion is, because you are not demonstrative and expressive, right? People who are neurodivergent can vary in the way they process sensory input and also their emotional output, right? Some may be more reserved with their facial expression, some may be more demonstrative, okay? So there's that. And then there's also the aspect of like a lot of socialization. I'm not sure what has happened to a lot of these spiritual places over the years, but many of them focus a lot on socialization, right? And so if you are introverted or you just prefer your time away from people, you are going to feel shamed in this environment. And this is not even having to do with neurodivergence, right? So maybe this spiritual space is having like 3 or 4 events every week and you don't go to any of them, then they may, pull you aside and say, oh, we haven't seen you. Is everything okay? Why aren't you showing up? This is what we expect, all this other stuff. And so imagine being neurodivergent and feeling a lot of this intense pressure to socialize. Now, I'm not saying every neurodivergent person is an introvert, but what I am saying is that when somebody's brain varies in the way it functions from a neurotypical brain, which is more aligned with society's norms, they're they're going to have a lot harder time fitting into social situations. I listened to this podcast and somebody talked about how he has ADHD, and he said that he was the kid that never got invited to birthday parties. And he said it was a painful experience for him. And he was able to look back and see like why the other kids didn't like spending time with him. But that's what happens. So imagine, now you're a grown up and you're in church and there are all these social situations. It can be exhausting for a neurodivergent individual to um, try to interpret what's going on so that they fit in. You may have heard of this term called masking, and masking is basically kind of putting up a front so that you are not outed as neurodivergent. You're trying to do whatever you can to fit into that space, right? It's not, and I also want you to be careful about looking at masking as something negative. It is not done with the intent to deceive people and get things out of them. It is more of trying to fit in. And so it takes a lot of emotional energy for somebody who is neurodivergent to mask in those settings, right? And so masking can look like, looking around the room, looking at how people may perhaps arrange their bodies while they're talking, right? It could be that. It could be knowing what thing to talk about and not knowing what thing to talk about. For neurodivergent people, that may be really hard for them. The whole read the room thing can be difficult. And so they might say, okay, this person talked about this, and so it's safe for me to talk about something similar, right? Imagine doing that all the time. It's going to get exhausting. And so, um, I really recommend that for spiritual spaces, think about people who don't fit your norm and how you can accommodate them as well. When there's always this emphasis on friends, 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 and socializing and all this other stuff, people don't like it. I remember talking to a coworker once that said that he went to a particular church and they were very big on socializing, and they called him because he wasn't going to any of the events. And he told them, look, I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to listen to the word of God, get what I need to get, and go home. And you're well within your rights to do that. No, no, you don't owe anybody a relationship or a friendship or anything. So there's that. And then I'd say probably the most important thing or most important way that you need to be aware of in terms of how these spiritually abusive environments can harm neurodivergent people is that there is this emphasis on you are flawed, right? And so it not only is the emphasis on being flawed, it's now something we have to fix. And a lot of these spaces will make it seem like if you just pray this thing away, it's going to go away. I have heard people say from, a pulpit that, these are things you just pray away, right? Pray away the ADHD or pray away the OCD. And when in my individual work with clients who are, who have these conditions, these messages make things worse for them, right? Imagine being neurodivergent and you already maybe prayer is a normal part of your life, and then you're hearing that, well, if you just prayed more, this thing would go away. It's not that simple. And I probably will do another video on this, but one thing that I get very upset by is when people who are not qualified to speak on mental health issues in the church to do that, right? We call it maybe like plain therapist or whatever. And so these individuals will have a very surface knowledge of neurodivergent conditions and say, well, just pray it away or don't take your medicine, right? Stop taking your medicine, stop going to therapy, stuff like that. In one of my videos, I have talked about the us versus them mindset of spiritually abusive environments. And so when a neurodivergent person is getting services that are helpful for them, whether it is in therapy, whether it is a schoolwork accommodations, whether it's medication, whatever it is, they're being told, nope, you don't have enough faith in God if you're using those things, and you should throw out your medication. And that is a very harmful thing to do. And to let you know how harmful that is, people who are licensed professionals in therapy, like I am, I'm a psychologist, but those who are not licensed to practice medicine, if they tell somebody you need to stop taking your medicine because I said so, they're in danger of losing their license and could get disciplinary actions against them or get, their license even revoked. That's how serious it is. So imagine somebody who's a mental health professional who's licensed and knows more about medicine than your pastor or your small group leader, but those people are telling you stop going to therapy and stop taking your medication, right? And so there are many ways, and I might even do like a part two on this, about how I feel like neurodivergence is something that any spiritual space, whether it's spiritually abusive or not, needs to do a lot better in terms of supporting these individuals, right? I feel like in general, a lot of these spiritual spaces they tend to be very superficial. They tend to focus a lot on, socializing and having friends and doing things together and, building community, but it's their way of building community. they have to understand that maybe, that other people have their own communities. Maybe they don't want to build community with y'all, or maybe they just have, their own definition of what community means for them. And so I'll end the video now. And in the comment section, I would like to hear from you all. If you feel comfortable discussing your neurodivergence, great. If you don't completely understand, but if you do identify as neurodivergent, what has your experience been like in faith spaces, spiritual spaces, even the ones that aren't spiritually abusive? And how have you handled that? So I'd really like to hear from you all about that. If you'd like to book a free consultation with me, my website is skillsetcounseling.com, and you can book a free consultation by clicking on the orange button. All right. I hope you have a wonderful day that is filled with peace. Bye-bye.